Imagine you're in Iceland, an Asian Iceland. You belong to a country that is on the continent, and your country is having a war against another country, which casually is in Iceland too. Your country loses, and the other enemy Iceland takes control of some territory of the continental part of your country. And that is when you notice that something is wrong. Your country has agreed to cede part of the territory to the country that just defeated them. In that ceded territory, you find yourself, even when in your lands, the conflict had nothing to do with it. And knowing how bad the other country treats their conquered lands, you try to sell yourself to Western countries like Great Britain or France, without success, because they all reject you. And now, you find yourself in an unfortunate situation. Your country, China, just gave you to the country that just beat them, Japan. And you, Taiwan, do not agree to this. So now, as Republic of Formosa, you will defend your independence at all costs. This is how the Japanese invasion of Taiwan began in 1895. Well, after this impressive introduction, it's time to dive right into the conflict. First of all, we have to ask if the Japanese invasion of Taiwan is really a war as such, or just a militarized interstate dispute. And well, according to Daniel M. Jones on page 163 of his article Militarized Interstate Disputes, first, an MID is made up of at least one militarized incident. Second, militarized incidents must occur among one or more interstate system members. And three, a militarized incident is an overt action taken by the official military forces or government representative of a state. So, for the first part, an MID is made up of at least one militarized incident. In the case of the Japanese invasion to Taiwan, we have a lot of militarized incidents. Just to mention a few, we have Rugamf and Kilon conflict, the Tang-Jisung fight, the Japanese occupation of Taipei, the Japanese occupation of Tamsui, and the Japanese capture of Hishu, among others. So yes, in this case we have more than one militarized incident, way more than one. So for the second part, militarized incidents must occur among one or more interstate system members. In the specific case of the Japanese invasion, it occurs between the Japanese Empire and the Republic of Formosa. So yes, these incidents occur between two states. And finally, for the third part, a militarized incident is an overt action taken by the official military forces or government representative of a state. In this case, the Republic of Formosa leader was its president, former Chinese general, Tang Jisung. On the side of Japan, there were quite a few commanders, but the most representative was Prince Kitashirakawa Yoshihisa, a member of the royal Japanese family and general of the Imperial Japanese Army. So again, yes, the militarized incidents occur between official military state forces. But, in the end, this conflict actually fulfills the requirements to be a militarized interstate dispute, but what we wanted is to see if it is an actual war. And for that, we have the definition of Melvin Small and David Singer in page 9 of the book Resort to Arms, International and Civil Wars, that basically says that for a war to be a war, it has to fulfill the operational requirement of having a threshold of 1,000 battle-related fatalities of troops in combat. And according to several sources, this conflict had 14,000 casualties from the Republic of Formosa side, and 164 casualties from the Japanese side. However, diseases such as cholera and malaria increased the Japanese casualties up to 4,642 casualties. After having defined that, in effect, the Japanese invasion of Taiwan is a war in all of its definition, I would like to start with two icebreaking questions. First, how should we classify this conflict? And second, what is at the heart of this conflict? First of all, we have to classify it as an interstate war between the Empire of Japan and the Republic of Formosa. This is an asymmetrical war, since it is not a battle between two similar powers. In fact, the forces at that time were quite uneven, since in the case of Japan we have the hegemonic power of Asia, probably the country with the largest military force in the region, and probably one of the countries in the world with the largest military force overall. On the other hand, The case of the Republic of Formosa is quite different since we have a newly formed country with insurgent guerrillas and remnants of the Chinese army from the Qing dynasty who defected and stayed behind to defend Taiwan. So, you're comparing a country that had defeated all of Qing dynasty China with moderate ease with a country that its remnants was precisely that Qing dynasty, in addition to the fact that with the Japanese capture of the Pescadores Islands, Chinese military capabilities were greatly diminished in the Taiwan island, since the pass was blocked by the Japanese army in advance of the peace negotiations. So, the objective of the Empire of Japan was precisely that, to demonstrate to the world that its military capabilities had nothing to envy to the West, and that by taking many Western military tactics, it was possible to modernize its armies to the point of winning wars against Western powers, such as it was the case of the war against the Russian Empire later on. And this is precisely the answer to the question, what is at the heart of the conflict? Well then, Japan's territorial aspirations and its desire to become a world power through being the hegemonic power in the Asian region. Now that we have established the basis of the conflict, I want to return to what I mentioned about the Japanese occupation of Los Pescadores Island as a crucial point of the Taiwanese occupation, so that this is not a random point that I mentioned to make sense of my explanation. But for that, it is necessary to mention the phases that this conflict had and how it evolved over time. For that, I'm going to take the classification that the scholars like James Willard Davidson and Takeyoshi Yosaburo made about this conflict. Firstly, we refer to the First Sino-Japanese War as the starting point of the Japanese invasion of Taiwan, since the end of this war marks the beginning of this other one. Since the Japanese domination of the Qing dynasty in China makes the latter give in to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, in which in exchange for the cease to the fire, China, among other things, ceded complete and total control over the Pescadores Islands and Formosa or Taiwan, in addition to other territories. This is done in a context in which the Japanese army already controlled the Pescadores Islands. This was done with the strategic purpose of leaving the island of Taiwan insulated from continental China, with the aim of giving up control of the island more easily. After the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed on April 17 of 1895, the Qing dynasty administration of Taiwan Island was expected to withdraw. However, Tang Jingzhang, the Qing dynasty governor of Taiwan, remained in the island and proclaimed the Republic of Formosa later on, something that was seen by the Western community as a way in which continental China avoided ceding control of the island to Japan without violating the provision of the treaty, since they were the first to recognize the formation of the new country. However, the Republic had little support from the own Taiwanese population, so a fragile government, little international support, and little military force is what marks the beginning of the Republic of Formosa, against a blunt Japanese empire with the hope of occupying the island. It is here where academics that I have already mentioned, such as Davidson or Takeyoshi, and even Henry McAlevey, agree that the first phase of the conflict begins at this point. The first stage was marked by the arrival of the Japanese Empire on the island, where warned by the resistance of the recently formed Republic of Formosa, they changed their place of arrival from Tamsui to Keelung, where the Imperial Guard, commanded by Prince Kitashirakawa, devastated with the local resistance, and ended up occupying the city of Keelung with only 2 dead and 26 wounded. Subsequently, the Japanese army makes its way to the city of Taipei, where the Taipei garrison troops leave their post, and added to the invitation of Taiwanese businessmen to the Japanese representative, the Imperial Guard also occupies Taipei. Finally, with the flight of the president of the Republic of Formosa from Tamsui to mainland China, the Japanese troops find zero resistance when they occupy the city, where they end up conquering it in less than a week, without the need to open fire due to the surrender of the few remaining Chinese soldiers, thus sealing the first phase of this war. The second phase is marked by the increasing guerrilla participation in the conflict, since the Japanese Imperial Guard encounters more resistance in the city of Hsinchu, finding resistance from the Formosa guerrilla and Formosa militia. However, according to James Davidson, these soldiers were poorly trained and poorly equipped, added to their low morale and their desire to return to continental China as soon as possible, the Japanese Imperial Guard devastated these troops until local leaders such as Chiang Xiao-tzu and Wu Tenzin take command of the Formosan resistance and presents a greater challenge to the Japanese. However, although the Formosa guerrillas were already better trained, they did not have the modern artillery, which eventually led to their defeat against the Japanese, capturing the cities of Miaoli, Baguashan, Changhua, and Talibu in the process. Finally, the third phase is characterized by the arrival of Japanese reinforcements on the island, since these, although they were winning the battles and capturing the cities, were increasingly met with more resistance from the Formosa guerrillas. However, with the arrival of the 2nd Provincial Division of the 2nd Japanese Army in Manchuria, and the 4th Provincial Division from Osaka, the Japanese army ended up capturing Yunlin, Chaiji, and Shaoyan, until they received a surrender offer from the President of the Republic of Formosa, Liu Jiangfu, in which he pleads for the condition in which Formosa soldiers will not be punished for taking up arms against the Japanese, in addition to ensuring their future transportation to continental China. The Japanese do not accept this offer, and this leads them to the capitulation of Tainan, being in October 21, which added to the flight of the President of Formosa of the first phase. This marks the beginning of the Japanese occupation in Taiwan. Having already summarized the entire Japanese invasion in Taiwan, it is also important to also mention how the conflict was resolved and if attempts at peace negotiation fled during it. As already mentioned, the conflict was resolved with the Japanese military victory over the Republic of Formosa, and although there was an attempt by President Liu Jiangfu to seek a surrender that would ensure the return of the remaining Formosa soldiers, this ended up failing to appear in person. Liu Jiangfu didn't attend to this negotiation meeting, so these were ignored by the Japanese Empire, and in turn they later demanded the unconditional surrender of the Republic of Formosa. On the other hand, I consider it important to mention that the triple intervention by Russia, Germany, and France at the beginning of the war in April 1895 took place, and it was on the harsh condition imposed by Japan towards the Qing dynasty of China in the Shimonoseki Treaty. The Western powers argued that the Japanese demands were excessive or abusive, and that the Empire of Japan should return control of some territories to China, such as the Liaodong Peninsula. In the end, due to the threat of the armies of the three Western powers towards Japan, the Japanese Empire decided to cede this control of these Chinese territories. However, seeing that Russia occupies the entire Liaodong Peninsula, Germany occupies the territories in Shandong Province, and France and Britain seize the advantage to control several port cities, the Japanese Empire takes this as a threat and begins preparations for what would end up leading to the Russo-Japanese future war. However, that is a story for another video. And finally, I consider that the means of negotiation that were used in this conflict were not adequate, since all the powers used intimidation and military threats as a method to make the other party give into their demands, and that ultimately ended up unleashing a spiral of violence, for which I consider that, having respected the Treaty of Shimonoseki from the beginning, and non-constituting the Republic of Formosa, would have avoided the more than 14,000 casualties that occurred during this conflict, as well as the triple intervention of the Western powers, which only ended up increasing the tension of this conflict and later on ended up having or leading to this Russo-Japanese war. That's it. This is basically all the work. Now you have the QR code to the references in a Google document. My name is Aldo Hernández, and this was my Evidence 1 Audiovisual Presentation Conflict Analysis.